Welcome to Everyday Therapy, where simple and practical concepts of therapy meet your everyday life. Hosted by licensed marriage and family therapists Brett Cushing and Krista Overson, we're here to help you unlock tools and strategies you need to become the best version of yourself. Whether you're looking for guidance, inspiration, anecdotes, or actionable advice, you're in the right place. Let's dive into Everyday Therapy.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Everyday Therapy. Brett, what are we going to talk about today?
Today, it's the topic of abuse, and we have touched on this much in the past. We're going to be talking about physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse, and we have talked about it quite a bit. I know we spent 3 episodes talking about sexual abuse in the past with Lindsay, and I think that was in the summer, of 2024.
That was an amazing conversation as well, because she talked about her recovery.
She did.
Yeah.
And that really incorporated not just sexual abuse, but also
all forms,
emotional and physical abuse.
Yes. Yes.
So we're going to try to break all 3 down in a short period of time. And I feel badly about it because it's such an important topic, so serious, and to talk about it in such a short time frame can almost cheapen how painful and how serious this is.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think given the, kind of the time constraints that we have, we'll do our best to give an overview, just so at least the listener can walk away with some basic knowledge, but I completely agree. And yeah, I guess just like a trigger warning, if anyone has experienced sexual abuse, physical abuse, etc. We probably won't get into too much detail, but just to be aware and take good care of yourself.
Yeah, and if you're finding some symptoms where you're just kind of feeling a little panicked, or you're feeling like some tightness in your chest or your throat or in your stomach, take a break and distract yourself in some positive way.
Yeah.
Take good care of yourself.
Absolutely.
Take a break.
I guess a good place to start is probably that there's lots of different forms of abuse. And it could be defined as repeated harmful behaviors that can cause physical, emotional, or psychological harm. Obviously, physical abuse is a bit more straightforward. Although, of course, as with everything, it can have its subtleties. I think one of the trickier ones to understand is the emotional / psychological piece of abuse, right? Abuse can occur in any relationship. So it could be family, romantic, at work. And that's another piece about it that's a bit surprising, right? Because I think we tend to think it's only those closest to us that might do this to us.
Yes, it can be total strangers. There's road rage, and people can do some pretty heinous things to other people. And I think it's easier sometimes to get away with emotional abuse, for instance, with a stranger.
Exactly.
Because it's almost like a drive-by. You do it and you're gone, and there's really no consideration. It's almost anonymous.
So true.
So it's prevalent. Go ahead.
Well, no, I was just going to add to that. I think with someone close to us, it's even more confusing if we're being emotionally abused, because we have this cognitive dissonance that's like, this person loves me, so they wouldn't abuse me. And I think that's one of the trickiest parts about it, is if it is at the hands of someone close to us, we're like, well, this doesn't make sense, so maybe it's me.
I just had a client yesterday talking about this, and it was very intense physical abuse by his dad. And he kept saying, why are you doing this to me? He was kind of recalling it as a child, and what he kept telling himself as his dad was committing these acts of physical violence against him, he was struggling with just what you were saying.
Yeah, why?
Dad, why are you doing this? Why? I don't get it. Whereas you contrast that with somebody who we don't know and they treat us poorly, it's very easy, or easier, I should say, to recognize that wasn't right. Now, however, when we grow up and we're continually abused, we can kind of have this belief about the world that it's an unsafe place. And we even learned, the same person said something really powerful. I learned how to just take abuse from people. And so we can sort of generalize that. We learn it as a survival skill, for instance, in the home, and then we generalize that and we take active positions that are more passive to just get through it, because that's what we've learned.
Exactly.
And then, we even just talked about substance abuse, the previous episodes, and that's a great opening to self-medicate all that too.
Right. Exactly. One other just kind of overview piece about abuse is that it's never the victim's fault. I think that should be stated very clearly, because I think part of being abused is that confusion, like you were just saying with your client, of why is this happening to me? Maybe I've done something to deserve this.
Yes.
So
we struggle to make sense of it. And a big part of what constitutes trauma, something, any event becoming trauma, is the meaning we attach to it. And so we're very confused when this is happening to us by somebody we're supposed to be able to trust.
Yep.
And then it's like, why? Now, I also heard this too by a man, I think his name's Dan Allender, wrote a book all about this, Wounded Heart, I think it is, and heard him speak. And he said also, sometimes the reason we, as those who've been the objects of abuse, conclude it's our fault is, he said this, and when he was a kid growing up, what's scarier, to think that I caused this or I had no control over what was happening to me?
That's such a good point.
So it's a subtle kind of way to get some control over something that you really didn't have any control over.
Well, that's such a good point, especially if it's at the hands of a parent or caregiver, because it's like, how am I supposed to make sense of this person responsible for my life? Like, my life is in the hands of my caregivers, and to think that they would hurt me or abuse me makes no sense. Right. So again, the logical conclusion, and it is logical in that perspective,
totally,
is it's me, right? I must have done something.
Right. And I think you've talked about this too, kids and their perception.
Yes.
Can you ever, like, did you want to elaborate?
Sure. Yeah. So just developmentally, young children have a narcissistic orientation. And I don't mean narcissistic in the way that we hear of it today, but again, just very self-focused because their survival depends on it. So they attribute the events of life to themselves more often than not. So the same goes for abuse, right? Or chaos, or all these different things and that's why you hear, with, especially if a young kid is sexually abused for years, that child and then eventually the adult feels that they were in some way responsible. Yes. And I guess not just with sexual abuse, with any type of abuse, that the person attributes it to themselves. Yeah. So it's,
pretty powerful. And as you just were really highlighting, this is lifelong for many people. The scars and the hurt from this can be lifelong, only because it's not really addressed early on. And so it doesn't by any means suggest that there's not hope, that you have to endure this forever.
Exactly.
We'll get to that at the end, but maybe we should talk about what abuse actually is.
Absolutely. Yeah, which one? I'm trying to decide which one to tackle first, because on the topic of like emotional verbal abuse, I've, not to brag, but read quite a few books about this topic. And so I guess we could just kind of kick off with that one.
Please.
So emotional abuse can have a lot of different components. There's some common behaviors: humiliation, criticism, or threats. Some of the controlling type behaviors, such as isolating from friends or social activities, ignoring or rejecting emotional needs. There's the manipulation. And I just think that of all the types of abuse, emotional/verbal abuse is one of the trickiest to diagnose and figure out, because it is obviously not going to leave a bruise, right? It's ongoing. There are studies that link emotional abuse with physical abuse, that physical abuse always has an emotional component before the fact.
Right.
But I just want the listeners to have a couple of resources. So one of my favorite books that I recommend to clients all the time is called The Verbally Abusive Relationship by Patricia Evans. Patricia Evans also wrote a book called Controlling People, about this dynamic of control and manipulation. So I would highly, highly recommend both of those. It kind of breaks down what's going on. And there were things in there that I was even doing, like when people do a put down and they say, well, I was just joking. I used to do that all the time. And when I read this book, I was like, oh my gosh, that's actually kind of a form of verbal abuse. Now, it depends on the person, right? It depends on the rapport and the kind of like banter that you have with someone. But if you're not careful, it can be, kind of a way of putting yourself in the one up position. So, do you have anything you want to add?
Very akin what you just described, very akin to male relationships.
Okay, sure.
We put downs.
Razz each other?
Yeah, you razz each other, you put each other down. Some men just don't have a context for that.
Mm-hmm.
Others, that's the way we try to connect.
Sure.
And then when we can't stand up for ourselves and sort of say, hey, I don't appreciate that, it makes it even harder to stop.
Right.
Especially with men. If you do say that, you're like, oh, what's the matter? Why are you being such a wimp?
Yep.
So we are conditioned almost to accept this and to reciprocate it in order to belong, in order to feel connected.
Yep. That is a really good point. And it just goes to show the power of what you grow up with, regardless if that's a cultural phenomenon or just your family. It can make it really difficult to recognize this because it could be also what you've always known. Right. So let's say there was a family I worked with one time who said, we speak fluent sarcasm. Right. Yes. So, and again, what we found was that they were always kind of using sarcasm to demean one another. Right. And it was just normal to them. Right. I won't go on too much longer because I know we have a bunch to cover on this topic, but so a couple of the more tricky to recognize signs of verbal or emotional abuse are, so put downs disguised as jokes, discounting. So when someone brings to your attention, like, hey, that hurt my feelings, discounting would be, oh, you're so sensitive. Right. Or saying like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Right. Also known as sometimes gaslighting.
Yes,
right.
That's right.
Another one would be countering, where, if I say, Brett, that joke you made really hurt my feelings. Well, you made one about me. Right. So kind of saying, because this other thing happened, I was in the right. Right. I think two, name calling obviously would be one, sure. But even something as subtle as, calling someone, like, oh, you're such a cute little dummy, things that are kind of backhanded like that.
Incongruent
messages.
Yes.
Incongruent messages.
I'm
exactly.
doing this because I love you can be another with physical abuse too. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So a lot of these, great point, are framed in kind of this like, well, this is just kind of how I tease you, or this is just kind of how we show our love in our families. We tease each other, right?
So, this is normal, so therefore you're not normal. If
exactly.
You don't. Exactly. I think an important distinction, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we've talked about domestic violence in the past, and that is definitely a form of abuse. In fact, there's a video on Gabby Petito documentary, I think, on Netflix now that I highly recommend.
Yes.
I haven't watched it yet, but domestic violence is absolutely a form of abuse. The goal of domestic violence, that there's tactics abusers will use, like emotional abuse, like that gaslighting.
Yes.
Where they just bold-faced lies presented as absolute truth. And there can be sexual abuse and physical abuse, but the goal of domestic violence is to absolutely dominate and control this other person. So it's a form of abuse with that end goal always in mind. Domination and control of the other person.
I'm glad you mentioned that specifically because right now the Gabby Petito story is kind of out there. A lot of people are watching the documentary. I did watch it.
Oh, good.
And there were so many hallmarks that they, went through in that relationship that Gabby had with her boyfriend, which was, he didn't like any of her friends. He didn't want her, her to spend time with them. Took her away from her family. I mean, again, just kind of like if you go down the checklist, just all the classical signs.
But I think one similarity there, too, is that someone who's a victim of domestic violence and someone's a victim of these other forms of abuse we're talking about here, there is this confusion. There's this, how do I make sense of this? And it doesn't happen to weak, vulnerable people. It can happen to any one of us where we are taken advantage of. And it's not that you're weak. It's not that it's your fault, like you said.
Yes. I know people that are smarter than me, highly educated. Some of the smartest women I know have been in relationships where they are emotionally abused, and it is the most disorienting experience
Yes.
ever, because it's like, how could this be happening to me?
Yes.
And also, maybe I am too, you start to second guess yourself. Like, maybe I am too sensitive. Maybe I am taking things too personally.
Great point.
Yeah. So
let's talk about physical abuse.
sure.
A little bit more specific about physical abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So this is when there's causing injury, physical injury
Yep.
and trauma. And it includes things like hitting, slapping, punching, kicking, shoving, burning.
Mhm.
It also can involve misuse of drugs or physical restraints with people to inflict that harm
Yep.
upon them.
Yep.
And so this can happen, again, any stage in life. Some of the most vulnerable people are at the beginning or end of life, with
Mhm.
children being abused as well as older adults, very vulnerable. We talked about domestic violence, and that can happen 1 in 3 women
Wow.
and 1 in 9 men.
Okay.
And that is just
Sure.
domestic violence. Then you have all of these other things we're talking about for abuse. So it's pretty prevalent.
Yep.
And so obviously we want to be looking for bruises and broken bones, and we want to look for cuts, unexplained injuries, and
Mhm.
we really want to take note of that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. How about sexual abuse?
Yes, this is the one that I think people have the most difficulty talking about.
I would agree.
Yeah, because it's so much more intimate,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a lot of shame in our culture about
Think you're right.
sexual things.
Mm-hmm.
And even though we're kind of, sex is glorified, it's also got this real shameful aspect too.
Yep.
So it's defined by the National Sexual Violence Resource Center as any sexual activity without consent. Any
Mhm.
sexual activity without consent.
Yep.
And so what do you think that involves?
Well, this is actually a really good point, because, again, there's going to be the more overt forms, such as inappropriate touching, fondling, penetration. So, and then there's the covert, such as non-contact behaviors. And I think this is a really big point I wanted to emphasize. Even something so simple as having pornography playing in the background,
Mhm.
and a kid is just around, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I would say too, adult, just even like R-rated films sometimes
Right.
could be.
Can be, because there's exposure.
Yes.
And
And if you're a young child,
Yes.
again, trying to make sense of that.
well, and even the R-rated thing, that's just very akin to if you see somebody masturbating in public. I know I've had clients who've had exposure to somebody doing that publicly
Yep.
as young teens,
Yep.
and they didn't even realize that is a form of technically molestation.
Yes.
And so your point,
Yeah.
even an R-rated movie that has explicit sexual context,
Mhm.
we don't have parameters to really protect, because a lot of people don't even realize that that is very much making an imprint.
Well, and I've had many clients who eventually, after a long time in therapy, have realized that, oh, my first exposure to even the topic of sex was I found the HBO premium channel, on
Right.
the home TV, and I was watching these things. And again, you're developmentally at a certain age, you can't process that, and you don't understand what it is. And again, it can just kind of get all these ideas in your mind about what's normal or about what's, and none of it, anything with pornography, is just, again, it does not represent healthy
Right.
sexuality.
Well, and it's so confusing too, because there can be enjoyment,
Right.
because that's the way we're designed. Sexual activity can produce pleasure, and then there's this added confusion and this mixed messaging. I had a guy tell me once that his family growing up, there was never any kind of physical touch
At all.
except the only physical touch he had was when his brothers would sexually abuse him,
Oh my goodness.
and it was enjoyable.
Sure.
And so you can see
Confusion.
a lot of confusion about that.
Well, and especially when there's a lot of, and this is very tragic, that a lot of times sexual abusers will tell their victims, I'm doing this because I love you, right?
Yes.
This is our special time together. This is our thing. This is our secret, right?
Yes.
And, so again, it can happen to anyone, regardless of age, regardless of gender. But in any case, there is help out there. I just want to throw in the National Sexual Assault Hotline, 800-656-4673, for those in need of support. So definitely reach out if you think you might be a victim of sexual abuse or assault.
And that number, one more time.
Yes, 800-656-4673. That's the National Sexual Assault Hotline.
And it is important to get help. And because there are longstanding effects of this, we can develop, well, it can be trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, it can be complex trauma. It can result in depression and anxiety, obsessive thinking.
Yes.
All sorts of additional mental health diagnoses that are related to this.
Yes.
It's something we want to suppress. We don't want to talk about because it's scary.
Yes.
It feels scary.
Yep.
And it feels like I'm going to be harmed all over again by even talking about this.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because there's this perceived but very real threat.
Right.
But there is help.
There is help.
And why don't we talk a little bit more about psychological, emotional impact of abuse?
Sure.
So we've talked about and alluded, it can have lifelong effects. I've talked about some of the other mental health diagnoses. Oh, also substance use disorders. We were talking about last episode.
Mm-hmm.
Even suicidal thoughts.
Right.
So that is definitely within the realm of possibility, and absolutely is understandable that people would have urges for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Exactly.
Also, developmental impacts upon children. Emotional abuse can alter emotional and physical health, as well as cognitive and social development for children. Brain changes in abused children impact their emotional regulation.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can see, and we talk a lot in these podcasts of moving our perspective away from what is wrong with him to I wonder what happened to him. And when we think about abuse that we've talked about, it's a much easier jump to go from what is that person's problem to I wonder what happened to them, and operate more out of compassion.
Exactly.
Effects of physical abuse would be increased likelihood of needing special education, repeating grades, and government assistance in adulthood. And the effects of sexual abuse are pronounced. PTSD, I talked a lot about those. But also, it's just the body, physiologically, there's an effect there too that's not talked about enough, although the book, The Body Keeps the Score, really does some great research on that and how this affects physiologically what happens as a result of any of these kinds of abuses as well.
Exactly. So I think in order to break the cycle of abuse, regardless of what type of abuse, would be to recognize the signs, either in yourself or others. And basically, abusers can manipulate victims to keep them silent, like we referenced before. And, speaking up and getting help is absolutely important. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of, it takes a leap of faith, basically. But otherwise, without recognizing what's happening, there's no way forward.
And it's hard because you can feel the world is, like I was saying before, the world is not a safe place. Know this, that if you go see a therapist, you will find an ally, you will find a very safe place. You'll find somebody who actually understands it possibly better than you even understand it yourself, which can be incredibly validating and begin a very empowering journey of you becoming your best version of yourself.
Exactly. There are support groups out there, like you had just mentioned, finding a therapist and getting help in therapy. Self-care and self-compassion are highly, highly recommended. It takes time, but it is possible to recover.
It absolutely is. And I would say, if you've had some of these, we've talked about EMDR therapy.
Yes.
Trauma intervention for addressing this. Very effective, incredibly effective. A lot of research on how effective it is. So you could seek out somebody who does EMDR therapy, and we've done some podcasts on that too.
Absolutely. So we hope that you will subscribe to our podcast, leave us a review, share this episode with someone, and again, just take really good care of yourselves following this episode. We know it was intense information, but again, feel free to reach out.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Everyday Therapy. We hope you're inspired to apply today's insights to your own life. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you found this podcast helpful, please leave us a review. It helps others discover the show and join our community. See you next session. Everyday Therapy is a production of Nystrom and Associates, one of the largest behavioral health organizations in the country. To learn more, visit nystromcounseling.com.